yourself into the chat so that I know that you're a real person. That would be really helpful.
And you may want paper and pen if you don't have that by you. Not 100% necessary, but you may want it.
So it is 5:05, so we are going to begin. And we're going to begin in the way that we have been beginning our sessions here. Debra's going to lead us in a little bit of grounding so we can align here on planet Earth.
Okay, welcome. Happy Thursday, everybody. Thank you for being with us. So we're just going to take just a moment just to be, and to be in space, and to be in your body, and to be in your heart. So finding what is comfortable to you. You might want to shift in your seat, you might need to roll a shoulder or your neck. Just taking the minute to actually check in with physical body. A lot of us have been sitting in front of screens way too much. And just allowing now a moment to just let the eyes rest. Just let the eyes rest down and allow the breath to flow in and out in whatever way that it wants to, whatever way that is comfortable in this moment. And now, making the choice to take in a big, deep breath and feeling it fill up the belly. Then just hold it and feel the intensity in your body when you hold that breath. And then as you let it go, actively allow the shoulders to droop down. So we're going to do that 2 more times in your own way. You're taking in the biggest, deepest breath you've taken all day, deep down into your belly. Hold it. Feel all of that intensity in the body as you hold the breath. And then when you can't hold any longer, you let it go and allow the just to kind of drip down. One more time, in your own way. Big, deep breath. Holding. And as you release, your shoulders just melt. Staying connected to your breath, and you still may want to keep a deeper breath, or you may just want to turn to your normal breath. And now, with those relaxed shoulders, you're going to bring your attention to the corners of your mouth. And you're just going to allow the corners of your mouth to turn up. So you're just going to bring to your mouth and to your face just a gentle smile. And then just breathe into what difference does it make if I bring just a gentle smile. And now in the next breath, just bring to mind something that you love. It might be chocolate cake, it might be your dog, it might be your mother, your lover. It could be anything that you want, but just thinking about something that you love. And then just breathe in that feeling of the smile, the attention towards something that you love, and then take that into your heart space. And feel now your heart's ability to smile. Just taking a couple of breaths with your focus being on love and your heart and the breath that goes in and out, and the love that you give and the love that you receive. For some days, just being love is enough. Give yourself a nice big deep breath, a big loving breath, and letting all of that love come out, and bringing yourself into the space, into the community, into the group with all of us here now. And welcome to today, and welcome to a moment of love.
Thank you so much, Debra. We have a gesture here in Fearless Communicators, which is this, we call this elevated sparkleation. So we're going to elevate it, sparklate you, Debra, Yaz, for that beautiful grounding meditation. So welcome to our Fearless Chat 13. This is a conversation around grief. And before we jump in, I'd love to introduce myself for those of you who may not know me. My name is Eduardo Placer. I am the founder of Fearless Communicators. We are an inclusive and dynamic public speaking coaching business, and we work with thought leaders on what they say and how they say it. And we found ourselves running our signature program in San Francisco. It's called a Fearless Force. There are various Fearless Force graduates here. If you can elevate it, sparklate our fearless women, those who participated in our Fearless program, yes. Angie was actually one of our participants. She's in San Francisco. We work with cohorts of women, and over the course of 6 days, they stand in front of an audience and share an original talk. And their event was canceled the night before the women shared. And after that, I found myself exiled from my home in New York. So I live in New York City, and I'm currently in Miami Beach, which is where my parents live. My parents are currently exiled also in Boston, so I am alone in their apartment. And immediately in the space that was created, we felt an immediate want and desire to lean into community and create a space to talk about and share about things that are top of mind. And we knew that the people in our community, our thought leaders, the people who we work with, our clients, are the ones we're thinking about and leading in conversations that are of real value in this moment. And in that space, we've had everyone from Allison Davis, who talked about heart-centered sales, to Jessica Robinson, who talked about cybersecurity, to Brandy Bernofsky talking about branding, also Jacqueline Romano, Michelle Garside. I spoke about storytelling. And if there's one thing that I can acknowledge about the stillness that has been caused in this, and I shared about this in the email, I don't know if any of you received that, that's what had you here, but being in the stillness, I started feeling sadness and loss for many things, right? First, there was not only like the future, right? There was what was being created, which is now lost. But more importantly, in the stillness, like there was years and years of sadness and grief that my New York City moving, didn't allow me the space to actually settle and listen to. And being at the home of my parents, what I have are all the pictures of my childhood.
Mm-hmm.
And what I did is, it took me about 3 weeks. I mustered up the courage and I grabbed a box, and it was a random box. There are lots of boxes, but I grabbed a box. And in that box were all the pictures that had been given to my grandmother and my great-grandmother, who were two of the most formative people in my life. And I was just so present to how much I miss them. And I haven't consciously thought about the missing of them for years. And I think knowing that we were having this conversation around grief, there was also a little bit of avoidance, like, which is probably why I have this blanket, you know? And I can't think of anyone better to be in this conversation than you, Debra. So I met Debra 4 years ago. She was a participant in our first Fearless Force program. And talk about walking through the fire. And I'm going to leave what it is that you were going to talk about. I'm going to allow you to speak it, but really modeling the power of standing in the truth of the moment and sharing so fearlessly. Through that experience, she has then come on board to be a co-facilitator of our Fearless Force program. She's delivered every program with me since number 5 in New York, the 3 programs we've done in Australia, the ones in San Francisco. So has been a real advocate and partner in also women standing in their truth and sharing in that space of authenticity and vulnerability and power. And I'm just really honored to create a space for you to really share who you are and your leadership and your beauty and your grace and your heart with all of us. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to you, Debra Driscoll. Ladies and gentlemen, elevated sparkalation.
Hello. You know, thanks for turning up for yourself and for having the courage to open up the door and say, okay, I'm going to sit for an hour with fearless communicators and grief, because trust me, I know what that means and what that can bring about. So I see you and I say, well done, you turned up. So I wanted to just give you a little bit of a sense about me and my story so that you can understand who's talking to you today as the grief guide, who's the person who's giving me some advice on this very complex feeling that I'm having. And so I want to take you to, I'm 20 and I'm in the final stretch of my university degree. I'm studying theatre and I'm alive in stories, and I have this great relationship with magic and love and possibility. And I also have this complex relationship with my best friend, and his name is Nicholas. And I'm madly in love with him. He's my best friend and he's my lover. And we're in the final stretch of university, and then we hit the death scene. Nick chose to take his own life. So I went from one day being hopeful and connected to magic to the next day in a relationship with grief and death. And despite studying theatre, I had no idea what happens after the death scene. Like, what happens next? I don't know. No one around me really knew, and it was quite traumatic. So we were just kind of sitting in the muck of the grief and the death. And then 7 months later, my father died. Without warning, he had a heart attack and was one day with us and the next day gone. And so now my relationship with magic, love and possibility hit double death and double grief. And I was absolutely lost. And, you know, truthfully, I was a bit cranky about it. I didn't want this. I don't think I hadn't asked for it. I didn't know how to deal with it. No one around me had language for it. And so I made a choice. I made a choice to just kind of push it away, give it a bit of denial, cover it up. And I did what, you know, many 21-year-old university students could possibly choose. And I drank a lot of beer and I smoked a lot of joints. And I just didn't really feel it. And I just kept telling myself I was going to be okay. I was going to be okay. I was going to be okay. And spoiler alert, I wasn't. Like a couple of years later, I found myself in this collapsed position in the shower and I couldn't get out of the shower. I was not functioning anymore. And that was the moment of like way down the rabbit hole when you're in the pit of despair and you don't know how to get out. And this is the mid-90s when, you know, everyone's on antidepressants now because pharmaceuticals are all about the antidepressants. And so I was given a prescription of antidepressants, and I was given a referral to a psychologist, and I didn't like it. I wanted to believe in magic. I wanted to believe in love. I wanted to believe in possibility. I did not want the pharmaceuticals or the psychologist, but I had to do it because I was literally not functioning well. And at the time, I was even questioning antidepressants. I don't know if I'm depressed. I wasn't quite sure what was happening, but what I found in that process of getting out of that deep rabbit hole was I was sitting on a mountain of unresolved grief. And so I started to kind of work my way with that. And in the working through, I made a promise to myself. I promised myself that if grief ever came to visit me again, that I would sit with her. Little did I know at the time that 18 years later, my son Sage would die. 1 month before his 11th birthday, my son Sage didn't wake up one morning. So again, without warning, death came to visit, and my relationship with love and magic and possibility meets death. And here I am again. 3 days after Sage's death, I found myself in this very clear, I can remember it very clearly, this moment of complete collapse, but also complete clarity on my kitchen floor. Now, the reason I'm on the floor is that I'd literally collapsed there. Like my legs had given way under the weight of the shock of Sage's death. And I was just sitting in like the goo of the shock and the grief. And in that, I had this clarity, this moment of like remembering the promise I had made to myself. And I was like, oh, here it is. I hadn't thought about that in years. But then I sat with it and I was like, okay, I had promised myself that I would sit with this, and grief has come. So then in the muck on the kitchen floor, I reflected on what had been my journey from the time of making that promise to where I was now. And I saw that I knew so much more now than I did as a 21-year-old. I had been studying spirituality and natural medicine, and was now a Reiki master, and was a facilitator and a story weaver, and I had been working with people in their energy, and I knew so much more. And so I had some of the tools that might actually help me, but I still wasn't quite sure if this was going to be enough. So I made a second promise to myself. I promised to always wish the best for myself, and to not only be with the grief, but to work with and through it, even if it was the scariest or the hardest thing to do, but just to stay with it. And it's now 7 years later, and I have kept that promise to myself. I have wished the best for myself, and I still do. I still come back to that promise on some of the harder days. And the journey of navigating through has been so many things. It has been what you expect with the exquisite pain, but it has also at times been magical. And it's taken me to so many different places within myself and literally around the world. And it's brought me fully into my truth, which is my story that I stand in now, which is I am now at service to grief and grieving hearts as a grief guide. And it's from this place, from my learnt experience, that I sit with you all today and sit with the grief that we all bring.
Debra, I just want to just take a moment just to just acknowledge you for just the courage of your heart, and to just like share from such a place of such truth. I know that we're in a bizarre context like Zoom. Like, I'm sure there's an instinct that people would want to have this moment to hug you and touch you, and we can't because we're socially distanced, and Heidi's in Phoenix and Marg is in Australia and Nita's in Harlem. And I would love, you know, if there is something that you feel like sharing, I mean, the chat function exists for you to if you feel like you want to be in dialogue, if you want to offer something, and also to create the space to acknowledge that that grief is something that is real. The loss and the grief is something that's very real. And there are many things that we are dealing with in this space. And creating a container for that to be something that people feel free to also share, that we can bring that's what it is that you're working through into this conversation, so that it's not just the two of us having a conversation, but something that's engaged. And if you don't feel comfortable in the chat, you can also private message me, or if you feel more comfortable having it in your journal, like writing it alongside, I think would be also another tool for you. Okay?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is something Eduardo and I were talking about before connecting with you all on the Zoom today, was wanting to make a space for all of the stories and all of the experiences of grief, because grief is just as colourful as every colour in the crayon box, and it turns up for people in different ways. But one thing that I really wanted to do was to ensure that you had something that you could hold on to with this conversation today. And so when I was thinking about what could be shared, there's so many things that I could tell you, but I came down to wanting to just share 4 things with you. And there's part 1, 2, 3, 4, and they all go together.
And I want to acknowledge, so Ivy just shared that it's 15 years today since her dad died. Right. So just like, you know, an opportunity to hold the space for that, Ivy, like just loving you right now. And I just know the gift of also being with your grandchild right now, you know, and being with family in this moment, you know, and just like honoring all the various losses that we are carrying into this conversation, just like to create that space as a frame to give us something to hold on to, right? Not solve, not fix, but something to just like have as access, you know, as we navigate this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing, and everybody continue to share, because as much as possible, we want to be in relationship to it. So the first thing I want to talk about when we're thinking about grief is, I think grief is often misinterpreted or misunderstood, or not quite sure how to describe or be with. It can be a little bit tricky. And part of that is just the way that we are in a bigger society and in a bigger language with it, in that we don't have a lot of language for it. And so the first thing I want us to do is to all recognize the grief, because the grief is one thing, but it's not everything. And at the moment, there's so much going on. There's so many emotions and so many realities that we are feeling so many things. So the first thing I would like us to do as a community is to just identify for yourself, if I am experiencing grief, what is my grief? Now, here's the trick. This is how you can know your grief. Grief is the human response to the loss of something that you love. It's either something or someone, an experience, a place, or a person that you have lost. So grief has a direction. It lands somewhere. But for example, a huge grief for me is my son, Sage. Eduardo spoke about his grief for members of his family who are gone. For some people, that grief at the moment might be, I'm grieving the loss of my job, or I'm grieving the loss of somebody who's impacted by this experience of what we're currently going through. But the first thing that you want to do...
I wanted to add, you know, one of the women just wrote, I'm working with a young lady who's grieving her inability to conceive or carry a child.
Yes.
Right? And the loss of her father who died without having a positive relationship. So I think that, again, that we can expand that conversation, I think is a beautiful...
Yeah. And also grief goes beyond people. So it can be that it's a loss of a dream. It can be a loss of an aspect of something that you've been working on. It can be the loss of a belief. Because I'm noticing for me, I have some grief that I can't quite work with yet because I'm still finding my relationship to. I am having a grief that is emerging for me as an American citizen. That's what's emerging for me. And it's new and it's raw, so I'm in a new playground with that. So if you feel comfortable, you can add into the chat what your grief is directed towards. But just to be clear, grief is a relationship that you have to something that you love. You have to love first before the grief arrives.
Deborah, this is so profound. I remember I shared this quote with you. There was a play that was playing in New York City called The Inheritance. And there was this line that when I heard it, you're the first person that I called, which is, the moment you fall in love, you set a date with heartbreak.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that the very experience of love means that it'll be shattered.
At some point.
At some point, that whatever that is will be lost. And it was just like, oh wow, that's the truth. Oof.
Yeah. And the thing I want to say now about grief and what it is and what it's not is grief also likes to buddy up with other emotions.
Mm.
So sometimes if you can't quite be with the grief because it hurts too much, you might choose like anger instead. I've done that one. That wasn't pretty. Or you might, choose a different emotion to kind of like buddy up with it. Grief is also an experience that really activates in the body. And so you can actually feel like depressed, or for some people it can be anxious. So that's why it can be hard to kind of identify the grief sometimes, because grief likes to play with the other emotions. But I find just to bring in the simplicity for yourself, in grief has a direction, and the direction is in something that you love that you have now lost. So once you have recognized the grief that you're working with, the next point is you get to make a choice. So if you note in my story how the first choice I made was to kind of deny and push away and just kind of drink and party on and carry through. That was a choice that I made. That's the choice that I made about my relationship to that early grief in my 20s. The second choice that I made, which has served me well, was to wish the best for myself. So for yourself now, you get to make whatever choice you want with your grief. The reason the choice is important is because it gives you a place in the relationship. So a part of the fear that we collectively have around grief is that grief is this overwhelming thing that's going to come and take over and I'm going to be lost in it. And that can be true, been there too. That can happen and may happen. But you also have this place where you can stop for a second and make a choice. And what that does is it puts you in a relationship with the grief. So you're now working with it. So your choice, like mine, might be, I'm going to wish the best for myself. At this point, I also just want to acknowledge where we're at right now. Right now, there's so much going on. And grief may be coming up for attention. That's been sitting there for a while going, great, they're still. I'm going to go sit there now. That may be occurring, or it may be a grief you're feeling in response to what's actually happening. So when you're thinking about the choice that you're making now, really think about the situation that you're in. Because making the choice to have a big, deep dive into the grief may not be the most compassionate choice for yourself right now if you're homeschooling a couple of kids and managing your job and in the apartment for the 7th week with your family. Or if you're living alone and you actually don't have anybody who you can hug. You know, so really consider your situation in making that choice for yourself, because I think it's okay to make a choice of going, okay, well, at the moment, I'm going to recognize the grief and I'm just going to take a little nibble. Or I'm just going to be with the grief that emerges and allow the deeper grief to sit for later. So you can start to be in relationship to the grief so that you're making a choice for yourself. So at this point, I'm just curious if there's anybody who wants to share in the chat box around a choice that maybe is emerging for them, around a choice they may want to make about their grief, or if there's any questions at this point, what I've said already about the recognizing or the choice.
And you know, as a prompt, so if you feel, you know, in that, so if there is like a recognition and a choice that you're making, you know, please use the chat box to share. I want to share that some people have been in the chat box saying their personal journey is complicated. It's led to another career, an initiative to bring awareness around grief. Kath Crawford said that grief never ends, but it changes. It's a passage, not a place to stay. It's not a sign of weakness or lack of faith. It's the price of love. It's a reflection of how deeply you've loved. Ruby just shared, for years, I refused to grieve, did not know that I was grieving until I had a run-in with my boss, and I just couldn't function for years. I didn't realize at the time that I was grieving the loss of my parents' death, my 5 siblings, and an aunt.
Yeah.
I tucked all of that away and did not revisit until I feel into my house, refusing to go back to work.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm just present to is and there's also like the ways in which people are talking about the loss of connection to people they love, their friends, in isolation, right? The people who are socially distancing and quarantining alone, and the loss of human touch and personal connection. And I think that some of these deeper kind of relationships to grief are emerging, right, within that context, right? It may be exacerbated by the ways in which we're quarantining and socially distancing and isolating in this moment.
Yeah. Yeah. The thing about grief, which is an anchor for me, is grief is seated in love. So I find myself returning to that. Grief is the fact that you lost something that you love. So therefore, it has a relationship to love. So sometimes when I get overwhelmed by grief itself, that's one of the things that can help me to be in a relationship with it, to wish the best for myself, is that I remind myself that grief is love. That's a part of the relationship that is undeniable. And, you know, working with your grief doesn't mean that you're going to forget the person or forget the place or forget the thing or get over it. It just means that you're actually shifting your relationship with the love.
Ray just posted in the chat, I was in a job for too long and grieving that I lost my way and did not realize that I was resisting the grief.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Sarita, she just asked, will this recording be available? Yes, the recording will be available.
Yeah.
So Debra, I know that part of what your commitment is to share some tools.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like in the space that we're identifying and acknowledging the grief, our relationship to it, what are some tools that we can have, you know, to help us as guideposts as we are in relationship with our grief.
Yeah, so I had like a whole heap of tools that I wanted to share, and then I thought, but really, what's going to be useful to people now? Like, what's realistic now? And I think one of the things that is realistic now is what I call the big wave. So when you're growing up in Australia and you're learning how to swim in the ocean, you're at beaches which are like long and wide, and the surf is quite big, right? So, and you're a little kid learning how to swim, right? And so the waves are really big. And so you learn quickly, because you have to, how to manage the big waves. So how you manage a big wave in the Australian surf is the way that you can also manage a wave of grief that comes. So the thing that happens with grief is that grief asks us to be with it. And that's the part that's uncomfortable. And I need to tell you the truth. There's no way for it to not be uncomfortable. Grief is uncomfortable, and it is sad, and part of the process is just being with that. But sometimes that discomfort can feel like it's coming at you like a big wave. So what I call the big wave is where it may be an aspect of your day where suddenly you can feel it rising, you can feel the sadness, you can feel the exquisite pain of the loss. That's the beginning of the big wave brewing further out into the horizon. So when you're a kid learning how to manage the big waves, what you're taught is you need to be in a relationship with the wave. If you just stand there and stare at it, the wave is going to come, it's going to knock you, and you're going to go tumbling under the ocean, and then you're left fighting for the air, right? And it's really uncomfortable, and you get salt water up your nose, and it's bad, right? Nobody wants that, and after you've been dunked a few times, you figure out how to make sure that doesn't happen anymore. So when you're in the surf as a little kid, what they teach, and what I learned, is when that big wave is coming, you watch it come, you acknowledge the fact that it's coming, you can't pretend that it's not coming, because the ocean is bigger than you. You watch it coming and you choose your timing, you take a big deep breath, and then you dive in. And you dive underneath the wave, and then you end up on the other side of the wave. So using that same idea of how I was taught to survive in the Australian ocean as a little kid, you can do the same thing with grief, because what happens sometimes is that it just comes. It's just like, I get it, like sometimes something will spark a memory, or I'll just hear a song or something somebody says, and then suddenly my deep missing of my son is felt in my body, and my heart starts to kind of tense in. When that happens, what I do is I brace myself for the big wave. I just stop for a minute. I acknowledge the fact that the wave is coming. I take a big, deep breath, and I dive in. If I have available to me, that dive in might be actually going to lay down. It may be sitting down and just letting the ugly tears out. Or if I'm, say, on a Zoom call and the big wave's coming and it's not the moment to let the ugly tears out, I acknowledge the fact that it's there. I take the breath. I acknowledge the fact that I'm wishing the best for myself. And I just breathe through it, find my way through on the other side, and I let myself know that the big wave is in me and it's going to want my attention. And so then I'll figure out later that night, I might give myself a hot bath or go write in my journal or do something else that I know helps me, because the big wave coming is asking for my attention. So the thing to know about grief is patient, it will wait, but it will keep knocking. It will keep knocking on the door, and if you don't answer, it says, okay, well, we'll wait. Then it might knock a little bit more, and then if you don't really answer, it says, okay, it'll wait. The thing to know about grief is it doesn't just decide to not wait any longer and go down the hall and knock on another door. Grief will just keep knocking until it has the attention. So sometimes I think about grief like a toddler, like a little kid wanting your attention, but if you're too busy or you don't want to play, and you're like, yeah, I'll be with you in a minute. Yeah, no, can you just be quiet now? No, mummy will be with you in a minute. You know, like all of this. And what's happening for the toddler is frustration, because they just want a little bit of attention that they're not getting. And what happens then is the toddler goes into tantrum because they're not getting what they want. Grief will do the same. If you do not tend to it and keep pushing it away, grief will turn into a big wave, which is the grief tantrum, which is like, now I'm just going to come in because I've been knocking on the door and you haven't been opening. And so the first tool I let people know is just be in that relationship with it. When it knocks, just be. When it knocks, just be. Because there is no magic that takes away the moment of pain when you sit with the loss of the thing that you have loved or that you still love. But the good news is, when you do sit with it and you have a practice of being with it, you create this different relationship to it. So those moments can be eased and you can transition through them.
So Debra, I want to acknowledge, so there was one thing Alyssa just shared. I would like to acknowledge the challenges with grief after an abusive or destructive relationship. While there was love rooted in the relationship, the feelings that allow can leave someone dealing with a lengthy history.
Absolutely.
So thank you, Alyssa, for giving light and voice to that. And then Marg just shared, what if I'm holding the wave back with anxiety?
Yeah. I just want to acknowledge like both of those comments, so I'll just separate them out. One thing I was aware of in having this conversation today was I wanted to say at one point, in my journey, whether it was from when I was in my 20s or my journey of the last 7 years, it has not been a one-woman show. There has been various times when it was necessary for me to seek a healer, a psychologist, a writing group, a support group. There's been different moments when the grief asked for more than me. And at the moment that, because we're sheltering in place, it could be like places like now with sitting in community and listening and sharing the stories in the chat. You may find that if the grief that's emerging for you is overwhelming and the waves are too big, then start to consider what resources you have available to you. Because when we can share our grief and express it, it really helps to ease it. And you also deserve to be supported in the process. And so that might be somebody you seek out who this is the work that they do. Or it might be a trusted confidant, friend, family member who you ask, can you just hold this space for me? Like, I need to talk about this. So just wanting to plant that seed there for everybody and remembering that you deserve it. You deserve it because, acknowledging that you're feeling the grief and that it's overwhelming is not the place of oh no, now I'm shattered and, in this I should be stronger space. It's actually the moment of strength when you realise the waves are getting too big, I need an anchor. So keep that in mind for yourself when dealing with the complex grief that can emerge. And then thinking with the anxiety, or whether it might be anxiety or it might be another feeling that's mixed in with it, is just to actually be in a relationship where you can see the anxiety and the grief as separate, but then also see how they can play in with each other. Because like as I said before, grief likes to buddy up with other emotions. And so a part of your grief process might be, if grief is hanging out with anxiety, what you might choose to do is to say, okay, anxiety, you get the attention first. And to think about what is the seed of the anxiety and work with that to help to try to separate. And if it's too hard to try to separate, to start to examine the space between them. What creates their relationship? Why are they enjoying butting up against each other? And how can I create a relationship with them that is in somehow a position that is workable for me? So the thing is that there is no quick fix. There's moments when you can take the breath, when you can manage the wave that's coming. But grief, when you're working with grief, grief is a practice, like meditation or yoga or anything else that you're working on. But the first time you hit the yoga mat, you're not going to get the perfect downward dog. You have to work at it, and you have to move the muscles, and they have to shift. And it's the same with grief. Once you start having a relationship with your grief and start working with it, it's going to be clunky at first, and you're going to have to find your way with what actually works for me in working through this. But if you do stay with it, then you do get better at it. It's like me with my downward dog. I'm not good. My heels just don't go down, but they're getting better.
So Deb, so we were talking about the different phases of it. And in your relationship, we started with recognizing it, then the choice of a relationship to it, then tools. And then the last phase, right, is what?
Transition. The last phase is transition, and transition comes later. But I wanted to talk about the transition because what it does is it gives you the wider horizon of the possibilities and why we work through our grief, why it's important to answer the door when grief comes knocking. And the reason is because when we work with our grief, we work with our capacity for love. Grief is a love vibration, it's seated in love. And if we diminish or squash down our experience and processing of grief, then what we're doing is we're actually also diminishing our experience of love, joy, laughter, sorrow, anger. If we diminish one, we diminish all. In particular, with grief, when we work with the vibration of grief and we find a way to be with it, what happens is we work the heart, the energetic heart muscle gets stronger. The more grief that we can process, the more joy we can experience. The deeper you go, the higher you can rise. So just keeping that as like your trajectory with, why can't I just want to push it away and pretend it's not there? Well, what is the point? The point is that the human experience wishes for the expansion of all possibility, and one of those great possibilities is our capacity for joy. If you want more joy, you find a way to be with your grief, because it is one of the pathways to expanding your joy.
Debra, I'll never forget. So again, we worked together for the first time on the crafting of your speech that you gave in the first Fearless Force program, which was when you kind of came out of the closet as a grieving mother. You had come to New York City, you weren't talking about your son, you weren't sharing his story. And then actually on May 5th, which was his birthday, you stood on a stage and you came out dressed in black with a black tutu and glitter all over your face. You shared the story of your relationship with grief. And I'll never forget that what you said, and there are many women, many stories, and there are pieces that I take from all of them. And I'll never forget when you said that when your heart shatters into a million different pieces, there's no way that you can put it back together.
Not the same way.
And not the same way. However, in that space, what it does open is a greater capacity for love.
Because the broken heart can never fully be closed, because the broken parts create an access in and out. So your heart is open. If your heart is broken, it's open.
Mm.
And it's the way that we put ourselves back together again, which is what propels us forward.
It's, Ray just wrote, grief is the caterpillar, joy is the butterfly. I think I've ever heard that before, but I think that that's a beautiful
really
thing.
beautiful.
Ray. And Kat just wrote, so important to move grief and trauma through your body. Absolutely. This is not intellectual exercise. This is not like, but that a piece of it may be, and it really is energy. It's neither created nor destroyed. It's energy that's there, and moving is a part of it. And then Heidi said, and if we diminish our grief, as in it's not as bad as someone else's grief, are we then diminishing our capacity to engage in love? Interesting. I'm going to rephrase that again. If we diminish our grief, as in it's not as bad as someone else's grief, are we then diminishing our capacity to engage in love? I think that's a beautiful question, Heidi.
Yeah, and I would say, like, when people speak to me about their grief, they're like, well, like I don't know if I should be speaking to you because...
I think we lost you, Debra. Did you lose her volume? Debra, I think we lost your volume. Debra?
Yeah.
There we go. She's back. She's back.
Yeah. So what I was saying is that some people will say to me like, oh, I don't know if you want to work with me because, I'm grieving my dog. It's not like you. It's not like I lost my son. And I'm like, love is love and grief is grief. Like if you are experiencing it and it is your reality that you are holding this grief, then that has as much space in the world as any other grief. There is no kind of totem pole of, well, your grief is bigger, so therefore you get this or whatever. We get what we're given and we work with what we're...
And I think what's so beautiful, Debra, and you posed this at the beginning, is that, and people are referring to it, there's like, there is the loss of human beings, that there is the loss of people that we love, and then there's also the loss of a job, there's a loss of a pet, there's a loss of opportunity. And if we can become facile in acknowledging, oh, okay, what that feeling, okay, so loss is sometimes a great opportunity to get into relationship. Okay, so now I've experienced that the wave is coming.
The wave is coming.
Like there's a wave that's coming, and I love that wave metaphor. I grew up in Miami. I'm right on Miami Beach. I know, now the waves are not as big in Miami Beach as they are in Australia. But I know that you go through the wave, and I just think that's such a beautiful anchoring to be able to track it. And that's the feeling. That's what's emerging. Okay, it's not just a wash of experience, but I can name it something like wave, like grief. Okay, let me move through it. And then there's something on the other side.
Yeah.
Right?
And in response to the moving through it, and this is in part with what Kath was bringing forward, I advise to move through it in the way that you would move through life. Some people like to sing, some people like to dance, some people like to write, some people like to walk or run. Whatever your kind of moving through process is, for me, it's writing. And so I process a lot with writing. If you're not someone who writes a lot, I'm not going to advise you to process your grief with writing, because it's not going to work.
Right.
If you're someone who likes dancing and making up songs, do that. Whatever your creative expression is to move through, because the cliche of like grief is a journey and it never ends, they're not actually, like, they are cliches, but they're true. And so finding whatever your movement is as you're diving underneath the wave, and go with what is naturally in tune with you already, is how you're going to find your way through.
I just want to acknowledge, Debra, as we start, wrapping up, and I know that you have an amazing opportunity for everyone who's on the call, but it's hard to not talk about. So Ray gave his quote about caterpillars and butterflies, and then Carrie shared that her sister and grandmother, she says, my sister and grandmother just showed up. They always appear as butterflies in reference and in the physical world at just the right times.
Yeah.
And then Lenny wrote, my first friend in life passed when we were 10 years old, and our whole school was swarmed with butterflies the week after her death, which also happens to be 20 years ago today.
Yeah. Wow. See, there is magic.
There is magic.
This is what I was talking about. You can have a relationship to grief, and that relationship can also be in a relationship to magic.
Mm. So Debra, I know we're nearing the end of our time here, and Lori is armed with a quick little thing. So why don't you share, Debra? I feel like Oprah. This is like the true Oprah. This feels like everyone's getting a car here, but it's better than a car. What is everybody getting, Debra?
Everybody gets one if they want one. Yeah. So my offer is for the month of May. May is my son's birthday month. And he would have been 18. So Sage and I, in spirit, are celebrating his 18th birthday by giving moments in May. So a moment in May, if you choose to book one in, is a 30-minute Zoom session with me, where we sit together and we co-create whatever it is that you need for your moment. So it might be talking through the big wave. It might be, I might pull an oracle card for you, playing magic. I might guide you in a meditation. We might share stories, laugh, cry. Whatever needs to happen in that moment is what will happen in the moment. And so that's my offer for the month of May, is anybody can book in a moment in May. And there's many of them throughout the whole month on the calendar link that has been shared by Laurie. And there's more. Everybody on the call is going to receive the replay to this chat today from Eduardo in a day to whenever that happens. And attached to that will also be the sample read from my memoir. So in January of this year, I published my memoir called A Series of Surrenders, which chronicles the 3 deaths that I spoke about at the beginning of this call. But more to that, it goes into the deep dive of what have I been doing for the past 7 years? What are the processes and what did I learn by being with the grief and processing Sage's loss? So everyone is going to get the sample read to A Series of Surrenders. And you can always reach out and contact me, whether it's a moment in May or you want to share a story or whatever may be.
And as part of this generosity, if that's something that they would also love to share with someone who they know and love, to whom this would be of value, like, I think what I love, Debra, is like in honor of Sage's spirit, also in his turning of 18 and in this month, is the opportunity, if you are in relationship with someone who is processing and dealing with grief, like, what a beautiful gift is that opportunity, knowing the various ways in which grief is touching, loss and grief are surrounding all of us in this moment. It's just a beautiful tribute and a beautiful opportunity. Kath just wrote, tomorrow is my beloved birthday, and I never thought I would stop grieving, but I have now turned my grief into love. Is BD birthday, Kath? Okay, great, just making sure. I lost him to the deadly AIDS virus, and COVID is bringing up a lot of emotions. Thank you, Deb, your words were so comforting. So thank you for sharing that, Kath. And I know that, as a gay man, the way in which the way in which we're in language around status and checking and art, like all of a sudden, even though there's a part of me that came out in the early 90s, there is a language that is strangely familiar about how now everyone is in relationship to this. And just want to, just within that statement, just really just honor all the lives that were lost in that plague. So thank you all so much for joining us for our call today, Fearless Chat 13. You all have a special invite, which I will share for next Tuesday. Tuesday is May 5th, which will be Sage's 18th birthday. And it is also the 4-year anniversary of our Fearless Force program. So the day that Debra stepped in front of the world and shared the truth of who she was as a grieving mother, also marks 4 years since she shared that, and now 4 years since we've run this program. We've done over 19 programs with over 100 women who've participated in that program, again, all over the world. And we're going to celebrate women. We're going to celebrate their stories. We're going to celebrate their accomplishments. And it's going to be a blast. There will be stories. There will be movement. There will be poetry. It's going to be an engaging, entertaining celebration. So you are all welcome to join us in that celebration. Again, we have several women here on this call that were part of that. We have Angie, we have Marg, we have Emily, we have Valerie, we have Ivy Wolf-Turk. So it'll be a beautiful celebration of that accomplishment and these women and their stories. And then what we're going to do is we're going to kick off a 4-part series, which we're calling Spark, Shift, Shit, Shine. I'm going to say that again. It is called Spark, Shift, Shit, Shine. And it's a 4-part series that is all around, now that I feel like now we're like week 8, we'll be week 9. In this context, there's a lot of stuff that's emerging, like ideas to pivot, ideas of new projects, new expressions, right? So we're going to start with Barbara Senrick, a Fearless Force alumna. These are all Fearless Force alumna that will be sharing. She's going to talk about how we spark our fire. So really connecting also in a physical way, and then an intellectual way to what sparks us. Then Tiffany Brown, another one of our women who talks about pay equity and corporate culture, is going to talk about how we shift and how we pivot as someone who's had to shift and pivot many times in her professional career. Most notably when she started a business in 2008 and then everything tanked. Then we're going to move to Amy Noel. Her talk is about getting shit done. There is nobody who gets shit done better than Amy Noel. She runs the largest B&I group in New York City. She runs she has a full-time job in HR and for a big tech company. And she runs a nonprofit called Lend a Hand Uganda that works with giving food to children in Uganda. And she's a professional baker. And she's a professional baton twirler. She is like, and it's all about how we get shit done. And then Zoe Flammenbaum, who did our Tel Aviv program, is going to talk about how we then bring it shine and give it shine. So that's a 4-part series that's going to be celebrating, again, our Fearless Women after we do our big celebration on Tuesday. And we have more programming coming. I am so moved by the faces that I'm seeing over and over and over again. I think Brian and Heidi and Carrie, I think you guys, and Allie and Pat, all of you who just keep on showing up to this, so moved by your continued presence. I want to acknowledge my godfathers on this call, Henry Fernandez from Indianapolis. So he is on this call. And always remember to fear less, speak free, and love more. So if this is complete for you, Our call is over. I will be in communication over email. If you want to stay for a couple minutes afterwards and just be in a conversation around what you got out of this and what your big takeaway was, we will keep this open. We actually have a woman from Australia who I'm going to now allow in. She may have thought that this was earlier, but Christy Samios is now coming into the call. But anyway, so thank you so much. We will see you next Tuesday. And if you choose to stay on, we'll keep holding the space for a little bit just to be in conversation with Debra and just to share what your biggest takeaway was and if there's anything else that you would like to share.